All right, thank you. So, um, as the title suggests, I'm going to talk about a Gulf Coast tick. That is another thing that you guys should be watching out for, and hopefully educate you a little bit more about one tick that didn't get covered this morning that probably is already in Pennsylvania somewhere if you look hard enough. So, um, just to make sure that the term I'm using, range expansion, some people will call it an invasion. Range expansion is much more of it's moving into an adjacent area, and so it's a little bit more of a precise term. And as we've talked about many times and other folks have talked about today, there's a lot of tick species that are on the move. And it's really important to track these movements and understand where they're going for the risk of ticks and tick encounters and tick-borne diseases. I think most everyone is aware of the expansion of Lyme disease, right? From 96 to 2014, it's expanded a great deal. And is coming down. I am down here in Virginia, and we have since had it come into sweep through Virginia in the last decade, has expanded in a lot of different directions. And with most things, our maps in the US, but Canada is also experiencing expansions into Canada. So the black-legged tick is on the move in a lot of directions. It's been mentioned a couple times that the Lone Star tick is in a move in a different direction. I started studying it in grad school in the mid-90s in Tennessee, and that was the northern edge. And now it is all the way indeed into Canada, certainly through Maine, up through North and South Dakota. I've heard reports up there, Michigan. So they're all on the move. So those are ones we're kind of aware of. But I wanted to make sure that you're aware of another one that's on the move, which is the Gulf Coast tick, something I've spent a lot of time over the last 10, 15 years looking at here in Virginia as it's moved in. So it is a three-host tick, like a lot of the ones we've talked about. So the larvae and the nymphs, an adult male and female, are very ornamented. They kind of have this interesting cross where partly they look like dog ticks and partly they look like Lone Star ticks, and they are very large. The adults are very aggressive. There's not a whole lot of reports of the larvae or nymphs feeding on humans, but certainly the adults feed on humans. Their mouth parts are actually so large, it's the first tick I've ever known that consistently people say you can feel it when it bites you, and I can attest to that. It feels somewhere between a bee sting and a mosquito bite. So a very large and obnoxious bite. The larvae and nymphs and adults, we're still trying to figure out exactly what their preferred hosts are. So they're very understudied and much more difficult to study than a lot of the ticks, and I'll tell you a little bit about why. But I do want you to be aware, if you're going out looking for these, we were confused in our first year or two and went back and looked through and found that the one on the left here, this is an American dog tick female, and the one on the right is a Gulf Coast tick female. And so their coloration and their size and so forth can be very similar. And the most differentiating factor in a lot of ways are the mouth parts, where I always tell my students when I'm teaching them that dog ticks, the mouth parts are wider than they are long, and on Gulf Coast ticks, they're longer than they are wide. But it's and also they'll both bite humans, so just be on the lookout for that. According to the CDC map, which was last updated in 2010, this is the extent of the range of this particular Gulf Coast tick. So originally it was assumed to be along the Gulf Coast, hence its creative name. And then there was a population that's been traced to a cattle movement up into the central Midwest here. And this was a very specific anthropogenic movement. But this movement up the eastern shore, and then there's actually been a lot more reports that aren't on this map, and I think it's time we work on getting this map updated. There's been a lot of more places than that. Pete Thiel did a great job in putting all the historic records together, and so all these dots this is that whole anthropogenically introduced section here by cattle, and there have been little ones and twos drop-offs all over the place over history. But what we're starting to find is there's a whole bunch of recent reports. So starting in 2014, we found, folks found that the Gulf Coast tick was moving into Ohio. We had Gulf Coast tick moving into Kentucky and Tennessee. We found it in Virginia, along with the folks up in Fairfax who found it about the same time in Virginia. There's a report this summer of the first spotted tick, a Gulf Coast tick spotted in Connecticut. There's now expansion front over in Illinois. There's reports I've heard from New York and New York City having populations. Delaware has populations. New Jersey has populations. I just heard on a call yesterday with some other folks that West Virginia has their first established population. So this tick is definitely coming soon to a site near you. And a lot of what we like to think about is trying to understand how these movements are happening. And Gulf Coast ticks are kind of unusual in how they're moving. And so a lot of these, you think about, ticks don't really run that far, maybe 30 meters if they're really highly motivated for food. Some don't move at all across space. They'll just sit and wait. So their travel time is going to be on hosts, and their distance is limited within the distance the host goes. And even if they are on a host and the host moves, then where they fall off when they're done feeding has to be suitable. So there has to be additional hosts. There has to be an environment where they can survive. So it can't be too dry, can't be too wet, can't be too lots of other things. And a lot of times when we're thinking about immatures moving, well, they better be lucky enough to have moved with the tick of the opposite sex, or there's not going to be any mating opportunities once they get to a new environment. And so there seems to be this whole complex need for things to happen to be moving into a new area. And so this all came about because here at ODU, we've been studying ticks since 2009. And so we have a long-term surveillance of tick ecology here in the area. And so go out and collect ticks from the field. We bring them back to the lab, we sort them. I have collaborators who do wonderful PCR work and determine all the pathogens they carry. And then we're putting it back together and doing mathematical modeling to understand high-risk areas and looking hopefully eventually to some control methods if they exist. And so through this process, we've collected about 275,000 ticks now. And I can tell you, I think I know less now than I do when I started, because the more you learn, the less you know. We go out collecting mostly through flagging. So we do transects, set transects. I'll show you a map here at a number of sites where we do by distance. We do rodent live trapping. We go to hunt check stations when they still exist, stop at roadkill, work with veterinarians, work with humans that go out in the field. A lot of our vector control guys here will give us ticks off themselves. We've done some mist netting. We sample reptiles. We're just trying to get a good picture for really what's happening from a dynamics perspective of the ticks in our area. And have done this pretty consistently since, for the last 10, 12 years now. So our main sites that we collect at quite consistently and have since the beginning are the orange dots here. So looking in Virginia and then into the zoomed in area in the southeastern Virginia where we are on the coast. So these sites we try to find a grassy area, a wooded area, and an edge area to try and sample in those transects. And so what we found when we went out and doing this is I was told there'd be 3 species of ticks. There'll be black-legged ticks, there'll be dog ticks, and there'll be Lone Star ticks. And I was really interested in the Lone Stars. That's where my background had been, and that was with a tick I was interested in understanding how it was moving and what was happening in Virginia. What I didn't expect was to find this Gulf Coast tick. And so if we look just at the numbers of the Gulf Coast tick, and this is the first 4 years or so of our sampling, and these are a variety of sites. So VB1 is a Virginia Beach site, and Yorktown site, a Chesapeake site, one over on the Eastern Shore, and you can kind of see there's a number of sites where you'll get 1 or 2, 3 or 4 here or there. But there was 2 sites that we got decent numbers over time. And the one I'm going to talk about the most is this one over here in Chesapeake. And so what you can kind of see is there's this, found them in 2010, there was more of them in 2011, fewer in 2012, fewer in 2013. The last one we caught there was in 2014, and we have not seen them there since. And so it really became this interesting question where, why do we find them? They're an established population, and then they're gone. And so what we learned from that particular site was this was a Nature Conservancy site. So if you look at these pictures at the top, in 2005, just before we started there, it was an open, old agricultural field. By the time I started sampling there, they'd planted a few saplings. But we called this was our Stevens grass area. This was a Nature Conservancy was returning it to dismal swamp territory, so it was being let go fallow. By 2011, the trees started filling in. By 2015, it was pretty tall trees, and now it's completely closed canopy, and the canopy floor is very established forest. So the first challenging thing to wrap your brain around is the successional rate in the dismal swamp and in the Hampton Roads area in general is incredibly fast, where you could go basically from bare earth to closed canopy in less than 20 years. And what we found, because we happened to have that window of time, was we had the Gulf Coast ticks coming through in this black line down here, right? And so we basically found that as the Gulf Coast ticks came up and went away, they were replaced by Lone Star ticks. And so our hypothesis was there's some sweet spot in secondary succession for these Gulf Coast ticks. And so the time frame that they like it is when vegetation is between about knee high and shoulder high. And this we tested and asked around, and the populations we knew about up in Fairfax were at an old landfill and then at an old jail, and the population we knew about in Delaware was at an old visitor center, at a wildlife refuge. A lot of the southern studies had been done in areas that had controlled burns, and so again, we can think of a lot of these areas as having that late secondary successional area. And so we started looking further into a lot of places, because not a lot of my sites were secondary successional. They were either maintained grasslands or already established forests. And so we went out looking for new areas that would possibly have Gulf Coast ticks. And at the same time as we were watching this tick come in, we also had another range expansion of an Ixodes affinis, related to the black-legged tick. And so we watched these two come through together, and each of these little dots here, we would go out and sample from 2012 to 2018, looking for both of those invading ticks to watch to see what we could find. And so we called it a state sweep, and unlike our sites that we hit every week or every other week back nearby home, these sites we got to once a year to say, do you have established populations of Ixodes affinis, or in this case we're talking about the Amblyomma maculatum, the Gulf Coast tick, just to figure out where it was. And through that process, we identified 5 now additional field sites. So to find established populations, we essentially have to be many hours away from home. And so between each of these dots, there really are no established populations that we have found thus far. We haven't had reports of them. We talked to a lot of folks. We found a couple more this summer, but we've basically had to go long distances. If we look at a little bit of an ugly map here, so stick with me for a second, taking some data from a published paper from Bruce Harrison and Marcy Tolliver and some of the other folks down in North Carolina, and all the green down in North Carolina, where any place they'd ever had a maculatum, and up here, all the colors are any place that we've ever had a maculatum. And they're here and there, and they can kind of imagine they kind of jump around a little bit, but if we restrict ourselves to established populations, what we find is there's 3 or 4, and a lot of these, once they've established, you go back the next year or 2 years later, and unless it's a maintained habitat, it's gone. And so it's kind of they're very ethereal, very come and go kind of ticks, and thinking about what could disperse them these kinds of long distances leaves a lot of questions. So how do they get from Hampton Roads to Fairfax? How do they get from the Hampton Roads to the Eastern Shore, even, which isn't all that far, but there's this large body of water between us? And instantly we blame birds. We looked at birds for 2 years, and we found not enough Amblyomma maculatum on them to blame them. So we're still scratching our head a lot about trying to figure out where they've come from and how they've moved around. So if we look at 1 second about back to the successional story, because this is something that we wanted to explore a little bit more and say, okay, maybe it requires this late secondary successional area. And so we drill into a couple of our field sites along the eastern shore of Virginia. There are barrier islands. On those barrier islands are scrubbed clean by hurricanes and nor'easters. And so every barrier island, this is Hog Island that's out there, kind of has this habitat view down here at the bottom, where you have the open dunes that lead into this interior thicket, and then you have this wax myrtle up into the maritime forest. And so this gradient, rather than being a successional gradient through time, is a successional gradient through space. And what we consistently found every year we go there is we get the Gulf Coast ticks right in that sweet spot of that barrier, right between where the open grass of the dunes ends and this ecotonal area, again, where you have about shoulder high vegetation. And so there's something that from our best guess is the rodent population, but we were like, okay, so these ticks are going to be just ubiquitous on these barrier islands and along the coastal areas, because most of the eastern shore of the United States is indeed scrubbed by these kinds of weather events. And I did learn, very surprised to learn that these islands, and especially the eastern shore islands, because how they're geologically built, come and go. So we've actually lost one of our islands where we had populations because Hurricane Matthew a couple of years ago subsumed it completely, so it's underwater now. And especially, I guess, apparently in the next 10 to 15 years, a new one should erupt, so we can watch for ticks coming on that. But again, the ones that remained, this ecotonal area. So last year we said, okay, well, if it's this zoomed in area, that the red areas should be where they're coming from. Maybe that's the source, and everything inland is just a sink that gets just sprinkled inland and goes away. So we went off last year and decided to try going down the coastline to see how many other places we could figure out if this was true, because we have, one site here in Hampton Roads that explains this. So we went off south. And the sad part of this story is, after a good week of quality time with my students in the car and stopping every couple hours, we found a single Gulf Coast tick at the southernmost site just south of Charleston here. And all the rest of this particular habitats, pretty much once we got out of the car, we knew we were not in the right spot because there was not enough understory to support rodents. Plenty of birds, plenty of other animals, plenty of evidence of large, medium, and large-sized mammals. And so based on our study of last year, we're fairly convinced that the small mammal population plays a pretty large role in establishment of these populations. So it was just a good lesson that every time you think you know something, these ticks are going to prove that you don't know as much as you think you do. So we're narrowing down our ideas. We still don't know where they're coming from. And one of the big reasons we're so concerned about these is they bring in threats for new pathogens, expanding pathogens. And so we were very interested in looking at the Rickettsia parkeri, rickettsiosis, or tidewater spotted fever, which is a spotted fever group rickettsiosis. So it gets reported often as being Rocky Mountain spotted fever because you cross-react on the serological tests for humans. But what we find in our area consistently is over 50% of the adult ticks that we collect have Rickettsia parkeri in them. And so being bitten by these guys could result in some of the spotted fever group rickettsiosis that's reported in our area. And also these ticks co-feed with lone stars and dog ticks, both of which are also competent vectors of this particular rickettsia, and both of whom we've found to be positive for this Rickettsia parkeri. And so while we get only a handful of these guys and hundreds of thousands of lone stars, the spillover into those lone stars may actually end up being more of a public health threat. If you go back down into the Gulf Coast area, there's very little Rickettsia parkeri in the majority of the ticks. And they have a lot more of this Candidatus rickettsia and DNA. We have found that in one tick or two ticks ever. And so another interesting research question we're really trying to understand is, why do you get a higher prevalence of the pathogen at the leading edge of these range expansions than you do back in the home range? And we don't know if it's temperature related or weather related or host related. And so we have a lot of research going on that will help us hopefully understand all of those things. So conclusions, right? Range expansion is a very complex puzzle. I expect you to hear, hopefully from some of you, maybe even if we have time for Q&A, of Gulf Coast ticks that you have found and curious about their habitat and whether their hosts can be figured out. Certainly more than climate change, because it's much more complex than that. And we have looked, by the way, at their genetics to try and understand if we could use population genetics to understand where they came from. And I think the scientific term is hot mess. They're just a complete panmictic, total mix of genetic types. So there's not a clear, this came from there kind of thing. And so we're really trying to understand these patterns and understand where they're going and getting the word out, because the spotted fever group rickettsiosis, tidewater spotted fever, while it's not as deadly as Rocky Mountain spotted fever, is still pretty miserable from everyone I've talked to that has it, and often ends up in hospitalization and even some time in the ICU. So certainly need to acknowledge, as with everybody else, the millions of students, I think it feels like at this point, who worked on this over the many years, lots of grad students who have gone off to bigger and better things, and my faculty colleagues at ODU who have done a lot of the lab work and other animal work as well. And with that, I will take questions. So the first question is the spillover, right? So Lone Star ticks, so if I find 50% of my Gulf Coast ticks are positive and I have 1,000 that I catch a year, that may be 500 ticks that are possible, but you feel them bite you. Lone Star ticks, even if we've usually gotten about 0.5% of the ticks we've collected, are positive for Rickettsia parkeri that can be transovarially transmitted in those ticks. And so it can then stay inside the ticks. And so of the 100,000, right, you end up with 10,000 of them perhaps that are infected. And so you're not going to feel them bite you as often. As Scott was saying, a lot of people don't remember being bitten by a Lone Star tick. And so I think Lone Stars are much more stealth, and the larvae could be infected with this because if the adults fed together, the female Lone Star tick could actually transmit this to her offspring. The immature Gulf Coast ticks on mice or small rodents, yeah, we find them consistently on rice rats and cotton rats. So that's what right now we're also starting to find some on roof rats. We found them on white-footed mice. We find them occasionally on a harvest mouse or a meadow vole, but generally rice rats and cotton rats seem to be the big hitters from what we can tell thus far. So the big question we have is actually the next two are what they feed on as adults. This is one of our big questions we don't have a good answer for. And I'm going to say this out loud because my bet is that they are on coyotes and black bear. We have caught a few off deer. We have caught them off cats and dogs occasionally, but we generally don't get enough large mammal information in June when they're up. June, July. Most of our large animal information is during hunting seasons, which tend to be in the fall, which is not helpful for adult populations. And so even back in the native ranges, Jerome Goddard and others have done a lot of work. Chris Paddock have tried to figure out a lot of these questions, and it just seems to be a very big challenge to understand what their hosts are. So hopefully, I have a PhD student working on this, so maybe she'll solve this for us. All right. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. And if anybody finds Gulf Coast ticks, I would love to know about it.